underlying message of this video series is that images are powerful. I think we get that and don't get that at the same time. That's because, on the one hand, consuming so many images makes us quite savvy about things like advertising tactics. But we also see so many images, and so briefly, that we can't imagine we're too impacted by the majority of those images. Images are just too commonplace to impact us that much. Well, we can start by observing that the knowledge that images are powerful is not new at all. Why did the most ancient societies we know build huge statues in town squares? Why did the powerful live in huge impressive buildings on view to everyone, and have themselves buried in massive tombs that are still standing today? Because what is known now was known then. Images are powerful. They make people think and feel, and they can direct their thoughts and behaviour. For this series, please keep in mind that you're watching a cultural historian looking at the power of images. You're not watching a cultural historian who is admiring the beauty of those images or approving the messages of those images. I definitely don't. I'm going to share images that I find personally objectionable and created for purposes that I find repugnant. I've tried to keep to milder examples, but it's possible that images will come up that you don't want to see. And this video really isn't important enough to risk that. So please just protect yourself. That's the priority. I have the luxury of being an outsider looking in, and I know that. I have sourced the pictures from either history sites or directly from books. Or, if I'm not happy enough with the kind of sourcing kind of background, I haven't included an image at all. No images, therefore, have come from hate-promoting sites. So we're going to look at a certain way of depicting people called a type. These types are certainly made and used with an understanding of the power of the image. In particular, how it can stand in for lots of information. Types are a shortcut. You know how you have shortcut icons on your computer desktop? Instead of a few steps to the website, like opening the browser, going to a search engine, finding it via a keyword search, or typing it out in the browser bar, you click on the icon and it takes you right through all of those steps and straight to the information. That's what a type does. It stands in for a lot of words about a group. It also, of course, is one individual that stands in for many. The intended response to this type and the group that they represent is a negative one. And we can describe those negative intended outcomes with a few dis words. Here's the dis list. We've got dislike, dismiss, discredit, discriminate against, and sometimes, but not always, dispense with. Some prejudice narratives say that the target group must be got rid of, eliminated. Can it really work? Can a repeated image really stand in for lots of information? Can masses of people recall the same thing when they see that repeated image? Well, consider that for decades, this sports clothing brand hasn't needed to actually include its name on anything. Just show its logo. This restaurant franchise no longer needs to display its name either. And this company can just use the colours that are recognised from their logo, and we know who's created that piece of work there. So yeah, it's the effect that we recognise in the logo today. So if we go back briefly to that statue in the ancient town square, we see what the first priority for public images was: the ideal figure. That's the king, or a great king of the past, or a god. In ancient culture, he is you. Your life is theirs. They are the purpose of your existence. That's how identity is represented, although that will become more complicated over time. An accompanying need to identifying yourself is identifying your enemies. Even in very early images, there will be a typical visual characteristic that marks them out. Here the victorious Assyrians are wearing helmets and their enemies are wearing headbands. They're not individual enemies normally, particular personages with names. They're representative figures, they're early types. This is the Bayeux Tapestry, which celebrates the Norman conquest of England. You can tell which soldiers are the English because they have moustaches. Very simple, but it works. Keep it as simple as possible. Simple is more reliable, like the logos. Now, you could say these two examples are propaganda. The enemies are strong warriors themselves. The stronger the enemy, the better it makes your kings look when they defeat them. In future, more complicated times though, enemies become more complicated. Individuals and people groups can be enemies for different reasons and be an enemy of a different type. Not necessarily strong rival equals, or that you necessarily want to put that idea about them out there. Also, when more people are writing and making images, there's no longer a unified view of who the enemies are. It becomes an opinion thing. This means you have to work harder to make your case that your target group is the enemy. You have to be persuasive. Sometimes you no longer want to portray that enemy as strong or an equal. And two visual practices arose in Western art which were very useful in this cause. They were caricature and the grotesque. Now, neither caricature nor the grotesque were methods exclusively for enemy making. They had their histories already, and among their uses they could be used affectionately. Their humour could be directed at peers, a kind of in-house banter, or at oneself or one's own group. In the 18th century, you start to have caricatured types, like these by Mary Darley, who called them macaronis. You see the visual aspects that we recognise from caricatures, the distorted and exaggerated features. But they're not being used to demonise these recognisable types. It's a kind of observational comedy about society. Grotesques could be the same. The word grotesque means from a cave, and that might seem to make sense because of the beast-like features we see in a grotesque, like a wild creature that's just emerged from a cave. But that's actually just a coincidence. The name derives from ancient Roman architecture, which was discovered by accident in Rome at the end of the 15th century, in the caves that were created by the construction work. The architecture features that they discovered there were more ornate and sort of chaotic than the Roman work that they'd known already. And so any image, including human images, that looked over the top visually, started to be described as grotesque, like those ancient Roman designs. My first example of a character type using caricature and the grotesque is by the cartoonist James Gilray. These are details from his cartoon called New Morality, which is from 1798. His target group is the working class. We can see that his working class types have exaggerated animal-like features, tails and hooves even. And I haven't yet mentioned the bum cheeks on view. Oh, well, I have mentioned them now. Animal associations suggest a lesser being. Cruikshank is telling us that, as a type, the working class are less intelligent, less civilised and less capable. He does not want an empowered working class, and is communicating how that would be an absurdity. The increased exaggeration is required because Gilray needs to increase the persuasion. It's not as simple as it was in former times. Not everyone feels that way about working class people, so Gilray can't assume everyone will make the associations he makes about the working class simply by having them present in an image. His points need to be pushed more. The function of a grotesque type is also that they are instantly dismissible. Remember, dismiss was one of our dis words on the dis list. This is the kind of power that the grotesque type has, that they don't even need to be silenced. Anything they say or do can be instantly dismissed because it is this type that is saying and doing it. Of course, having your backside in show while you're talking will have that effect. They discredit themselves, another of our dis words, discredit. They discredit themselves through being themselves. James Gilray's contempt and paranoia were real, but his animal associations are comparisons only. He didn't have a sincere belief that, in a scientific sense, the working class were a lesser species. Tragically, that sincere belief was held by others about their target groups, and was taken more seriously by people in the century that followed. Particularly post-emancipation, when the physical shackling of black people could no longer be practiced, other means for persuading other white people towards regarding black people with the dis words took its place, some taking it as far as the last one on the list, dispense with. One of the first things you notice in the type depiction is a kind of uniformity. Black people always being represented by exaggerated facial features, showing very little difference between one another. A prompt that persuades the viewer to think of the group as all the same. The animal associations we saw from Gilray were employed for this target group too. In this case, the suggestion of a lesser being was more than a suggestion. It was accepted by many as fact and backed up by pseudoscience of the time. The animal association was broader in regard to black people though, not just a lesser status but a threat due to allegedly being animalistic, prone to instinct-driven activities like immoral sexual practices and sudden violence when exasperated. Of course, you can see all these ideas serve to justify continuing to control this group and to prevent their empowerment. That's the motivation behind those images and that grotesque type. Colloquial speech and expression were exaggerated in order to make the target group childlike. It's a feature of character typing that would continue where there's no need to silence the target group because grounds for dismissal are already established in the type. For instance, in this case, if speech is represented as being childlike, so that then everything they do say or do will instantly be dismissed, discrediting through simply being that type again. I should just explain the absence of example images here. I wasn't confident enough about the image sources and the kind of image trail up to the point where I found the image. So I didn't want to take the risk. I'd suggest going to a museum near you that covers this era, or is a museum of black history, for instance, because then, you know, the subject viewing is going to be safe. The item itself is there in front of you. And actually, if any of you know of reliable sources that perhaps I could use and perhaps I could re-edit these videos using, please let me know. The images I have up are pre-emancipation, and they're sourced from Richard S. Reddy's book, Abolition. I'm including them to show how pre-emancipation these white European engravers didn't see the need to employ grotesque or caricature, because the people are already demeaned and dominated in the situation that they're depicted in. So because the European feels no threat, they feel no need to employ tactics of persuasion, you know, other sort of visual techniques. So let's go back to this grounds for dismissal that we've already brought up. Grounds for dismissal need to be examined case by case, because with one target group, those grounds will be different than grounds for dismissal of another target group. A grotesque figure will be grotesque in a basic or a non-basic way. So basic may not always mean bad. Basic bad is what we saw in the example just now. Childlike, animalistic, that's basic bad. But it might be basic good. Honest, no nonsense, salt of the earth type people, tendency to loyalty. You wouldn't put those sort of things in a grotesque because they're basic good. Also, non-basic might mean good. It might mean restrained, rational. But there's also non-basic bad. like calculating, slippery type, a tendency to disloyalty, and you might use non-basic bad in a grotesque type. Now, what we've seen already is propaganda. Propaganda is a modern Latin term that means the things to be spread. Now I'm going to imply something about propaganda that not everybody is going to like. That's because there are two views about what constitutes propaganda. There are those, myself included, who say that propaganda is as propaganda does. If someone is using the tools and tactics of propaganda for the purposes of propaganda, that is propaganda, whoever it is that practices it. The other view is that only institutions produce propaganda. That can be conspicuous institutions like governments and big corporations, or inconspicuous institutions like secret societies, for instance. Propaganda in our time is always understood as a negative word. It's what the bad guys do. And we are never the bad guys. Them over there, they're always the bad guys. So I acknowledge the difference in view and invite you to think about that yourself. I see propaganda as method and purpose, so I assume that in my examples. What we've seen so far is propaganda that isn't overt propaganda. It's not carried out by people who own the title of a propagandist and fully admit to carrying out propaganda. What we will look at next is two governments who had propaganda as part of their governmental structure. They had propaganda ministers. They were two totalitarian states, the Soviet Union and the Third Reich, Nazi Germany. The first of many people to head up the propaganda and agitation department of the Soviet Central Committee was Yevgeny Preobrazhensky. Having someone from the Central Committee oversee propaganda shows you how important the Soviet Union considered that to be. The Minister for Propaganda who maintained the role throughout the Third Reich was Joseph Goebbels. Goebbels was a doctor of literature and philology. He was Dr. Goebbels. Goebbels wanted to fight in the First World War. He was 16 when the war started, but he was rejected by the German army. He'd had a problem with a deformed and misaligned foot since birth. I think this is significant because in the Nazi Party, he got his wish to fight in a war, and his feet were no disadvantage. He got to fight with the weapons he was proficient in as a doctor of words. Visual types were used to depict the enemies of both the regimes. The chief target group for the Soviet Union was the capitalist. Precisely, capitalism's obviously really an antithesis to communism. Also, I think generally. So, if you just want to represent Westerners in general, then they're likely to take on the characteristics of the capitalist. So, as we can see, he's commonly fat because he himself doesn't work. He has grotesque facial features. He wears stereotypical clothing of the rich, probably the stereotypical clothing of the rich from maybe a couple of decades before then, but that's more established clothing of a rich person, you know. And that advertises his wealth more. The Third Reich had many targets. It was prejudice-driven, and its central ideology was the superiority of Germans. And so that makes a world full of enemies. The most conspicuous target, however, was Jewish people. In the Jewish character type, and also the capitalist, we see that the grounds for dismissal were not the same as we saw in previous examples. This type is not a bad basic, this type is a bad non-basic. They're calculating, they're sophisticated, they're looking to deceive people, they're not loyal to anybody. They're not even loyal to other capitalists or to the West, is the idea the Soviets would say. And we'll sort of look a bit more into the narrative around Jewish people as we go on. The narrative behind the prejudice, okay, here we are, in fact, so the narrative behind the prejudice towards Jewish people was that Jews conspired in all the places of world power to weaken the world for their gain. Hitler claimed two main forms in the world, one in the East, one in the West. The Eastern Jew had planted Bolshevism and controlled and weakened in that way, and the Western Jew had orchestrated capitalism doing the same thing. So they were just two prongs of the same united Jewish conspiracy. Hannah Arendt, a Jewish historian who'd lived in those times and the preceding years, identified two distinct types of prejudice. And this is important work because we start to understand from Hannah Arendt onwards that there are multiple types of prejudice. The two types she identified were social prejudice and political prejudice. The distinction is best seen in the different responses of the two different groups. The social prejudiced wall up around themselves and seek to segregate themselves from their target group. Violence only occurs if they feel provoked or that their boundaries have been crossed. The political prejudiced have narratives, like we saw Hitler had about the Jews. They were a threat, so you couldn't just wall up. You have to respond by preventing their world-threatening scheme. This may well go as far, as we saw in the Third Reich, as insisting that the target group be eliminated. Political anti-Semitism extended to this word on the list, to dispense with, as history, we know from history. Arendt said that social anti-Semitism was common throughout Europe. It was present in Germany, but Germany didn't stand out in that regard. Political anti-Semitism was not common, but it was present, and again, not noticeably more so in Germany. And the question has often been asked, partly because of that knowledge and partly because of what ensued, how a whole German nation could have been made to be a nation that was of one mind in this prejudice. Part of the answer is that one mind wasn't necessary. You just needed one mind out of a few. Just after the war, a book studying conformity called The Lonely Crowd identified two types of conformist. There was the inner-directed conformist, and there's the other-directed conformist. Basic way maybe to understand those two is that the inner-directed is likely to blame themselves, the other-directed is likely to blame others. Combine this with a simple condition, success or non-success, and you actually get four groups, and they can be appealed to become four types of conformist rather than, there's the ominous task of trying to make a whole nation one type of conformist. The easiest group to convince, referring to the chart now, the easiest group to convince is Group D, the unsuccessful, other-directed group. They are dissatisfied, and it's other people's fault. You've simply to insert the target group into them, and Group D will view them as an enemy, as a thief who stole from them. Their prime ground for being made into politically prejudiced people. The next easiest group is Group A, the successful, inner-directed person. They have achieved, and it was down to them. If they can do it, anyone can, and there are no excuses. They'll look at those who struggle with contempt and a lack of compassion, suggest that this group also weren't working hard, but they were cheating somehow, and you're going to increase the contempt that they feel towards those people. In their case, they feel contempt for the target group and no inclination to help them. They're less likely to be proactive, like Group D, who are politically prejudiced, but Group A are a consenting, socially prejudiced group. The other two groups are not as easy. They could respond in different ways and need to be steered based on their needs, but this is entirely possible. Group C are unsuccessful and see it as their fault, although they may not say so outwardly. They feel inner shame and welcome a distraction from that shame, endorsed by people in authority, which always just gives more weight to any notion, doesn't it? They could be convinced to be proactive, but will at least welcome the redirection from shame within themselves. Group B are the group who have experienced success and they know that they needed others to get there. although they may not say so outwardly. They can feel like a fraud and have a tendency to paranoia and an over-awareness of how powerful others are. If their paranoia is worked on, they can be convinced that a specific other group need to be put down, and they see that as the job of the powerful. It's for this reason that you need to keep the grotesque type quite broad. Not so specific that it only works on Group A, for instance. Concentrate on the dismissible and discrediting characteristics, and the different groups can fill in the rest of the picture with their own imaginations. The grotesque type has his counterpart, the ideal type. In the case of the Soviets, this was the worker, and in the Third Reich it was the Aryan German. You can see that both are usually male, and qualities are focused on their physiques. Soldiers were very effective in the German case, but actually workers and farmers were the soldiers of the USSR, so kind of the same thing. The ideal type doesn't have grounds for dismissal, he has grounds for recommendation. And these are very obvious opposites to the grotesque type. They don't have to be unintelligent, but they do see loyalty as higher virtue than intelligence. And these are not the simpler times of the ancient past, where the ideal can just be the ruler. There definitely was a leader cult, including like a lot of visual examples of leader cult in both of those regimes. But that's kind of for other purposes. The ideal type has to be one of you, or something one of you can possibly achieve in one way or another. You can relate to them, and it's possible for you to copy them. The Soviet Union understood propaganda to be for the included. The Soviets combined propaganda with agitation, which aimed to draw in new communists. That couldn't work in the same way in the Nazi vision, because if you're not already what they viewed as an ethnic German, you can't become a German. So the Third Reich only had propaganda, but they combined that with what they called enlightenment. But enlightenment is also aimed at the in-group, the already included.